My name is Faye Sterling. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with safe words: dependable, calm, practical. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in financial compliance for a mid-sized healthcare firm. I read contracts the way some people read novels. I notice what others skim. But if you asked my family who I am, they'd probably give you a shorter answer. Faye, she's the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who doesn't make a scene. It sounds like praise. It isn't always. There's a strange invisibility that comes with being the steady one. When you don't shout, people assume you don't feel. When you don't defend yourself immediately, they assume there's nothing to defend. When you quietly handle problems, people forget you were the one holding everything together in the first place. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone in a dramatic courtroom twist, and it's definitely not about humiliating anyone. It's about what happens when a lie spreads faster than the truth. And when the truth finally walks into the room, wearing a hospital badge and holding a printed payment history. A few months ago, my sister told our relatives, our church group, and even a few of my colleagues that I had refused to help pay for our mother's surgery. She said I had the money. She said I just didn't want to give it. She said I'd chosen my comfort over our mother's life. I didn't defend myself publicly. I didn't post screenshots. I didn't send group texts correcting her version. I let people believe what they wanted to believe, at least for a while. Because here's the part most people don't understand. Sometimes speaking immediately only feeds the noise. And sometimes silence is not surrender, it's documentation. What unfolded next happened in a hospital billing office, under fluorescent lighting, with a clerk who had no interest in family politics and every interest in accuracy. When she spoke up, the room changed. And what surprised them wasn't emotion. It wasn't drama. It was the payment history. If you've ever been misunderstood by the people closest to you, if you've ever been assigned a role you didn't choose, if you've ever decided to let the truth reveal itself instead of forcing it, then this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. I'm not telling it to prove I was right. I'm telling it because quiet strength is often mistaken for absence. Have you ever stayed silent long enough for the truth to speak on its own? In my family, I was never the dramatic one. That role belonged to my older sister, Claire. She had a way of entering rooms like she owned the oxygen. People listened when she spoke, partly because she was loud, partly because she was convincing. I was the opposite. I spoke carefully. I rarely interrupted. If I disagreed, I waited until the noise settled before saying anything, which often meant the conversation had already moved on. At family gatherings in Portland, the dynamic was predictable. Claire would tell animated stories about her latest project, her latest crisis, her latest breakthrough. My father would nod approvingly. My aunts would lean in. My mother would smile the proud, tired smile she reserved for public moments. And me, I was the one refilling drinks, clearing plates, making sure Mum had taken her medication before dessert. No one asked me to do those things. That's the part people misunderstand. I wasn't forced into invisibility. I stepped into responsibility. Over time, those two things started to look identical. If Claire needed help with rent once, it became a story of her rough season. If I quietly transferred money to cover a utility bill for our parents, it became, well, Faye's good with numbers. Not generosity, not sacrifice, just expected. In family group chats, Claire's messages came with exclamation points and voice notes. Mine were short, clear, and practical. When Mum first mentioned her worsening abdominal pain months before the diagnosis, I was the one who researched specialists. I was the one who checked insurance coverage tiers. I was the one who called the hospital billing department to ask about payment plans, just in case. No one remembers those calls. What they remember is who cried the loudest when the doctor finally said the word surgery. Claire cried. I took notes. And that difference defined us. There's something unsettling about being the calm one in a crisis. People look at you as if you're detached, as if composure equals indifference. I've been told more than once, you don't seem that upset. What they meant was, you're not performing it the way we expect. I loved my mother fiercely, but my love has always looked like spreadsheets, reminders, early arrivals, and contingency plans. It looks like showing up before anyone else and leaving after everyone else has gone home. In childhood, I learned quickly that praise was loud and temporary, but reliability was permanent. So I built myself around permanence. By the time we were adults, the family mythology was set. Claire was passionate. I was practical. Claire was emotional. I was stable. Claire needed support. I provided support. No one said it outright, but the implication was clear. I didn't need much. I didn't break. I didn't complain. I didn't demand acknowledgement. And when someone doesn't demand acknowledgement, people assume they don't require it. So when my sister eventually told everyone I had refused to pay for Mum's surgery, it fit neatly into a story they were already prepared to believe. The quiet one, the analytical one, the money-minded one. Of course she would calculate instead of caring. Of course she would weigh dollars against family. The version of me they carried in their heads made the accusation plausible. That's the part that hurt. Not the words themselves, but how easily they landed. Looking back, I can see that I helped build that image. I allowed myself to become the infrastructure. Invisible until something collapses. But infrastructure has words, and I had been keeping them for years. At that point, though, no one knew that, not even Claire. To them, I was still the dependable daughter, the calm one, the one who would absorb whatever story was convenient. And for a long time, I did. The first time I heard the story, it wasn't from Claire. It was from my Aunt Marlene. She called on a Tuesday evening, her voice already softened into that careful tone people use when they believe they're mediating something delicate. "Faye," she said gently, "I don't want to get involved, but your sister mentioned you're not able to contribute to your mum's surgery. Is everything okay financially?" Not able. The phrasing was polite, protective even. It implied struggle. It implied hardship. It implied that maybe I was embarrassed. But that wasn't what Claire had said. I knew her well enough to hear the subtext between the lines. Not able was the edited version. I kept my voice steady. "Who told you that?" There was a pause. The kind of pause that confirms more than it hides. "Well," my aunt said carefully, "Claire said she asked you directly, and you declined." She seemed overwhelmed. Declined. There it was. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the reflection of the overhead light on the granite counter. I could hear the dishwasher humming. I had just finished reconciling the latest hospital estimate against the insurance adjustment. The number sat in my planner in neat ink. Claire had asked me nothing. What she had done, 3 days earlier, was send a text in the family group chat. "We need to figure out how to split the surgery costs ASAP. I can't carry this alone." Before anyone responded, I had already transferred a payment directly to the hospital portal. The second installment in a plan I had quietly set up weeks prior. I hadn't announced it. I hadn't itemized it. I simply handled it. Because that's what I do. I told my aunt calmly, "I haven't declined anything. I've already been contributing." Another pause, longer this time. "Oh," she said, That's not what we were told." And there it was, the first small cut. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't an accusation shouted across a table. It was subtler than that. It was a shift in tone, a seed planted in someone else's mind. "Faye isn't helping." I didn't call Claire that night. I didn't send a corrective message to the group chat. I didn't forward the payment confirmation. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Claire was stressed. She always processed fear out loud. Maybe she had assumed I wouldn't contribute because I hadn't responded theatrically enough. Maybe she needed to feel like the sole warrior in the room. I rationalized it. That's what I've always done with small cuts. I assess them, measure the depth, decide if they're worth reacting to. Most of the time, they aren't. But here's the thing about small cuts. If you don't clean them properly, they linger. Over the next week, the tone around me shifted in subtle ways. My cousin's text messages were shorter. A church friend asked if I was managing okay. My father mentioned, almost offhandedly, that family means stepping up when it counts. No one confronted me directly. No one asked for proof. They simply adjusted their perception, and I could feel it. The story had begun to circulate. Quiet, sympathetic, slightly disappointed. Faye makes good money. Faye's always been careful. Faye probably thinks Claire is exaggerating. The narrative was forming without my participation, and I still said nothing. Not because I was guilty, not because I was afraid, but because at that moment, I believed the truth didn't need defending. I underestimated how powerful repetition can be. That was my mistake. The first small cut is rarely fatal, but it tells you who is willing to hold the knife, even gently. If the first cut was subtle, the next ones were almost polite. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as cruelty, it arrives as an assumption. A week after Aunt Marlene's call, we were sitting in the surgical consultation room with Mum. The walls were beige, the chairs were stiff, the air carried that sterile, faintly metallic hospital smell that settles into your clothes. Claire was doing most of the talking. "I've been trying to figure out how to cover everything," she told the coordinator, her voice strained but strong. "It's just a lot for one person." One person. I was sitting 3 feet away. I felt the words land, not like an explosion, more like a quiet adjustment in posture. The coordinator glanced at me briefly, then back at Claire. She didn't ask anything. She didn't need to. The story had already been framed. I could have corrected it in that moment. I could have said, "Actually, I've already paid 2 installments." But something inside me resisted the urge. Not pride, not martyrdom, clarity. I wanted to understand how far the narrative would travel if I didn't interfere. I wanted to see who would question it on their own. No one did. After the appointment, Claire pulled me aside in the hallway. Her eyes were red. Her tone was urgent. "I just need you to understand how heavy this is for me," she said. "I can't be the only one carrying Mum." The phrasing was deliberate. I looked at her steady. "You're not," she exhaled sharply. "Then why does it feel like I am?" That question could have opened the door to facts, to numbers, to timelines. Instead, I said, "What exactly do you think I haven't done?" She hesitated, just slightly. "Well, you didn't respond in the group chat, and you haven't offered anything specific." Offered anything specific? There it was again. The performance requirement. Contribution wasn't real unless it was declared. Support didn't count unless it was announced. I nodded once. "Okay." That was all I said. To her, my calmness probably confirmed her suspicion. If I were truly contributing, wouldn't I defend myself immediately? Wouldn't I pull up receipts on my phone? Wouldn't I demand acknowledgement? But here's what people misunderstand about documentation. It doesn't expire. I didn't need to rush. Over the following days, the disrespect settled into routine. Claire would update relatives about her efforts. She'd use phrases like, "I'm doing everything I can." She'd sigh heavily on speakerphone. No one asked me for my version. At church, someone squeezed my arm and said, "Your sister is so strong. She's really stepping up." I smiled politely. She is. Because she was. She was organizing. She was calling. She was visible. Visibility earns credit faster than quiet payments. I began noticing the subtle shifts more clearly. When medical bills were mentioned, people looked at Claire. When financial strain was discussed, they avoided eye contact with me, as if I were either detached or unwilling. It would have been easy to snap, to interrupt mid-sentence and list every transfer, every timestamp, every confirmation email. But anger is loud, and I have learned that loud corrections often get rewritten later as emotional outbursts. Instead, I started doing something different. I saved everything. Not because I was planning revenge, not because I wanted to humiliate anyone, but because I could feel the role solidifying around me. The practical daughter who calculates instead of cares. The one who withholds unless pressured. And once a role hardens in other people's minds, it becomes difficult to dissolve without evidence. The disrespect wasn't explosive. It was incremental. A comment here. An implication there. A sigh heavy enough for the room to hear. And each time I remained still. Not passive, not weak. Observing. Because when someone repeats a story often enough, they start to believe it themselves. And I needed to know whether Claire believed her own version, or whether she was simply relying on the fact that I wouldn't challenge it publicly. By the end of that week, something had changed inside me. Silence was no longer just my temperament. It was becoming a decision. There's a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when you realize you're no longer being misunderstood by accident. You're being understood incorrectly by design. It happened on a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. The living room was full. My father sat in his usual armchair. 2 cousins had driven in. Claire stood near the fireplace, holding a printed estimate from the hospital like it was a rallying flag. "We're looking at almost 40,000 after insurance," she said. "I've been calling everyone, trying to see what we can pull together." Trying to see what we can pull together. The phrasing was inclusive. The performance was singular. I sat on the edge of the couch, my leather planner resting against my knee. I already knew the numbers. I knew which line items were negotiable. I knew the charity care thresholds. I knew how much had already been applied to the principal balance. But no one asked me. Instead, my father turned toward me and said, "Faye, you've always been the practical one. Maybe you can help Claire figure out a plan." Help Claire. Not because she didn't know the plan, but because I was supposed to support her narrative, not alter it. That was the role, the reliable one. The assistant. The quiet logistical backbone behind someone else's visible effort. I realized then that I wasn't being accused directly anymore. I was being positioned. If I spoke up and contradicted her publicly, I would look combative. If I listed payments in front of extended family, I would look defensive. If I remained silent, I would reinforce the image of passivity. Every option carried a cost, Claire continued. I've already drained my savings. I just hope everyone can contribute what they're able. Several heads nodded. A cousin promised a small amount. My aunt said she'd see what she could do. No one asked what I had already done. And in that moment, I understood something that shifted everything. They didn't expect me to lead. They expected me to quietly supplement. My contributions were meant to be background noise. Invisible infrastructure. Necessary, but uncelebrated. It wasn't cruelty. It was convenient. Convenient. Claire had always been the emotional spokesperson of the family. I had always been the logistical safety net. It was comfortable for everyone to keep it that way. After the meeting dispersed, my mother called me into the kitchen. She moved more slowly now. The diagnosis had taken some of her steadiness. "Don't let your sister carry this alone," she said softly. There was no accusation in her voice, just worry. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And I realized she didn't know either. Claire hadn't told her about the payment portal, about the installment plan, about the direct transfers. Mum believed the story too. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. For years, I had accepted being the dependable daughter because it felt honorable. But honor without visibility turns into erasure. And I had allowed that erasure because it kept the peace. Standing there in this kitchen, I made a quiet internal observation. If I continue like this, the narrative will calcify permanently. Not because I lack evidence, but because I lack assertion. That afternoon wasn't dramatic. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. But something fundamental shifted inside me. I stopped asking how to be helpful, and I started asking, what truth am I willing to let stand? Because once a role is assigned and accepted, it becomes self-sustaining. Reliable, useful, invisible. I had played it well. Too well. The shift didn't happen in a confrontation. It happened on a Wednesday morning at 6:12 a.m., standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee I hadn't touched yet. The house was quiet. The sky outside was still grey-blue, the kind of early light that makes everything feel suspended. I was reviewing the latest hospital statement on my laptop, line by line. Total charges, insurance adjustments, patient responsibility, payments received. My payments were listed clearly, dated, time-stamped, applied directly to the principal balance. There was no ambiguity. I leaned back in my chair and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not hurt, precision. For weeks, I had been reacting internally to the story circulating about me. I had been measuring each comment, each implication, each sympathetic look. But that morning, looking at the numbers, I realized something simple. The truth was already complete. It didn't need embellishment. It didn't need emotional framing. It didn't even need defense. It only needed timing. Up until that point, I had been thinking in terms of fairness. It's not fair that she's saying this. It's not fair that no one asked me directly. It's not fair that Mum believes it. Fairness is emotional. Clarity is strategic. That was the shift. I closed the laptop and opened my leather planner. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote one sentence at the top. Do not react, document. Then I listed dates. Payments made, conversations overheard, statements repeated. Not because I wanted ammunition, because I wanted coherence. There's a difference between being silent out of discomfort and being silent by choice. Until that morning, I had been hovering somewhere between the two. But as the steam from my coffee faded, I understood that my quiet wasn't weakness. It was space. Space to observe. Space to see who questioned the narrative and who adopted it. Space to determine what outcome I actually wanted. Did I want an apology? Did I want public validation? Did I want Claire embarrassed? No. What I wanted was structural correction. I wanted the story to stop repeating. I wanted my mother to know the truth without feeling like she was in the middle of a sibling dispute. I wanted my integrity intact, Not loudly defended, just accurately understood. Later that afternoon, Claire called me. Her tone was brisk. I told the extended family we're still short, she said. If you're going to contribute, I really need to know how much. There it was again. The assumption that I hadn't. I didn't correct her. Not yet. Instead, I asked calmly, have you logged into the hospital billing portal recently? A small pause. No, why? Just wondering. I said, Silence stretched for a second too long. I could hear something in her breathing. Not suspicion, not quite awareness. Just the faint discomfort of a question she hadn't expected. That call confirmed what I needed to know. Claire wasn't tracking details. She was tracking perception. And perception, when unchallenged, becomes reality in social spaces. But reality on paper is harder to bend. That Wednesday morning marked the moment I stopped feeling misunderstood and started feeling prepared. I wasn't gathering proof for revenge. I was aligning myself with patience. Because sometimes the most powerful correction isn't spoken by you. It's spoken by someone who has no emotional stake in the story at all. And I had a quiet suspicion that moment would come. I just didn't know when, but I was ready for it. After that Wednesday morning, my silence changed texture. Before it had been instinct. Now it was calibrated. I still attended appointments. I still sat in waiting rooms with Claire. I still updated my planner after every call with insurance. But internally, something was different. I was no longer hoping the misunderstanding would correct itself. I was observing how far it would go. That distinction matters. When you hope, you wait passively. When you observe, you gather information. A few days later, Claire posted an update in our extended family group chat. Mum's surgery is scheduled for the 18th. I'm still covering most of the balance, but we're getting there. Still covering most of the balance. The phrase was deliberate. It didn't accuse me directly. It didn't name me. But it strengthened the narrative. Several relatives responded with heart emojis. One cousin replied, "You're incredible, Claire." I read every message. And I did nothing, because now I understood something important. Claire believed visibility equaled contribution. If she said it often enough, if she looked exhausted enough, if she sounded burdened enough, the social record would favor her version. And in social spaces, that often works. But hospitals don't operate on social perception. They operate on ledgers. A week before the surgery, we met with the hospital's financial services office to confirm the remaining balance. It was a small administrative meeting, fluorescent lights, laminated nameplates, neutral carpet, the kind of room designed to discourage drama. Claire arrived first and immediately began explaining the strain. "I've been making payments as fast as I can," she told the billing coordinator. "It's just been overwhelming." I watched the coordinator nod politely and turn to her computer. "What's the patient's date of birth?" she asked. Claire answered. The keyboard clicked softly. The monitor reflected faintly in her glasses. "Okay," the coordinator said. "Let me pull up the payment history." That phrase landed differently for me than it did for Claire. Payment history. I kept my hands folded in my lap. The coordinator continued scrolling. "I see multiple payments over the past several weeks." Claire nodded quickly. "Yes, that would be mine." I didn't look at her. Silence in a room like that feels amplified. You can hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint shuffle of paper, the pause before clarification. "Well," the coordinator said slowly, "there are payments from 2 separate accounts." Claire shifted slightly in her chair. "Two." "Yes," the coordinator replied. "One under your name, and one under—" She squinted at the screen. "Faye Sterling." The room didn't explode. No one gasped. It was quieter than that. Claire turned toward me, her expression not angry but confused. "I thought you hadn't—" she began, then stopped. I met her gaze evenly. I didn't announce it. The coordinator continued matter-of-factly. "Ms. Sterling has actually been paying since before the surgery was officially scheduled. The account is nearly 60% covered at this point." 60%. The number surprised even me. I had calculated roughly, but hearing it aloud, in a neutral, administrative tone, changed the air in the room. Claire blinked. That can't be right." The coordinator turned the monitor slightly so we could both see. Line items, dates, confirmation numbers, applied balances. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, just documentation. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because silence, when chosen deliberately, isn't emptiness. It's alignment. And at that moment, alignment had begun to surface. Not through accusation, not through confrontation, but through a system that didn't care about family roles. The truth hadn't needed me to shout. It just needed a clerk to read what was already there. But the real consequences of that moment hadn't even begun yet. Long before the billing coordinator rotated that screen toward us, I had already been preparing for that moment. Not theatrically, not with some dramatic reveal in mind, but methodically. What my family never noticed about me, what most people don't, is that I don't step into situations unarmed with information. I work in compliance. My entire profession revolves around audit trails, verification, and the quiet power of documentation. When Mum first mentioned her abdominal pain months earlier, I didn't just Google symptoms, I researched surgical cost averages in Oregon. I compared hospital financial assistance policies. I read through billing dispute forums to understand common errors. Not because I expected conflict, because preparation is how I love. After Claire's narrative began to take shape, the "I'm carrying this alone" storyline, my preparation shifted. It became layered. I downloaded every payment confirmation as a PDF. I saved screenshots of the portal reflecting applied balances. I documented dates of conversations, not to use against her, but to preserve sequence. I even called the billing department once, privately, to confirm that all payments were properly attributed to the account and clearly labeled with my name. "Everything's correctly logged," the representative assured me. "Full transparency in the ledger." Full transparency. That mattered. Because I knew something my sister didn't. Systems are impartial. They don't respond to tone. They don't reward volume. They record input. Claire operated in emotional currency. I operated in documented currency. There's no villain in that difference. Just two very different understandings of influence. What they never noticed was that I stopped reacting socially and started positioning structurally. When relatives made sympathetic comments toward Claire in group chats, I didn't defend myself. I let the chat history exist as it was, a record of perception. Simultaneously, I ensured the hospital ledger told a different story, a record of action. Those two records were moving in parallel, and I was patient enough to let them diverge. The more Claire repeated her version publicly, the more fragile it became privately. Because repetition without verification creates risk. She never once logged into the billing portal before that meeting. Not once. If she had, she would have seen my name attached to installment after installment. But visibility was enough for her. For me, invisibility was safer, until it wasn't. There's a psychological principle I learned years ago. People rarely question narratives that reinforce their existing beliefs. My family already believed I was the calm, financially stable, low-emotion daughter. So the idea that I might be withholding funds, calculating rather than caring, fits comfortably. No one cross-checked the data, except me. And that's the part no one ever notices about quiet people. We are often collecting information while others are collecting validation. I wasn't building a trap. I was building alignment because I knew that eventually there would be a moment requiring reconciliation between story and system. And when that moment came, I didn't want to scramble for proof. I wanted the truth already organized. That's why, sitting in that fluorescent-lit office, I didn't flinch when the coordinator mentioned 2 accounts. I had already seen the numbers dozens of times. The surprise wasn't mine. It was Claire's. And what no one understood yet, not even Claire, was that the revelation in that room was only the beginning. Because once documentation contradicts narrative publicly, the emotional consequences ripple far beyond a billing statement. And I was ready for those ripples, calmly. The real revelation didn't happen when the clerk turned the screen toward us. It happened 2 days later in a quieter room. After the initial billing meeting, Claire had gone unusually silent. She didn't apologize. She didn't argue. She simply said she needed to process. That word can mean many things: reflection, denial, strategy. I didn't chase her for clarification. Instead, I scheduled a separate, private appointment with the hospital's financial services office. Not to expose anything, not to escalate, to understand leverage. The coordinator I met with, a different woman this time, was precise and unbothered by family dynamics. I explained calmly that there seemed to be confusion about payment attribution and public communication. She nodded. "Would you like a full payment ledger printed?" "Yes," I said. She printed 12 pages, every charge, every adjustment, every payment source. My name appeared repeatedly, earlier than anyone in my family realized. But then she added something I hadn't anticipated. "Because you initiated the installment agreement," she said. You're technically listed as the primary financial contact on this account. I looked up. Primary? Yes. When you set up the payment plan, you accepted responsibility for managing the remaining balance. Responsibility? Not symbolic, not social, legal and procedural. Claire had been speaking as though she were carrying the burden alone. But structurally, I was the one tied to the account. The coordinator continued. If there's any dispute about who has contributed what, we can only release verified payment records. We don't discuss verbal claims. That sentence was the moment of clarity. Verbal claims are irrelevant. Documentation governs reality. I thanked her and placed the printed ledger into my leather planner. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady, because now I understood something fully. I didn't need to argue with Claire at all. The system itself contradicted her narrative. If she continued telling relatives she was carrying everything alone, she would eventually face a choice: correct the story privately or risk it being corrected externally. And hospitals don't whisper, they print. Driving home, I realized the leverage wasn't in humiliating her. It wasn't in forwarding the ledger to the family group chat. It wasn't in confronting her with highlighted lines. The leverage was in restraint. Because when someone builds a public image around sacrifice and documentation reveals shared effort, especially unannounced effort, the contrast speaks louder than accusation. That's when I made a decision. I would not defend myself socially. I would allow any correction to emerge administratively. If Mum asked, I would answer honestly. If relatives confronted me directly, I would provide facts calmly. But I would not chase perception. Claire's strength had always been performance under pressure. Mine was endurance under scrutiny. And in that moment, I understood that quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about standing still long enough for inconsistencies to surface. The payment history surprised the room. But what truly shifted things was this. The ledger didn't just show that I had paid. It showed I had begun paying before Claire ever framed herself as the sole provider. That timing changed everything. Because once chronology enters the conversation, intention gets questioned. And intention is harder to defend than emotion. I drove home without calling anyone. There was nothing to announce. The truth was already positioned. Now it was only a matter of when it would fully unfold. There's always a moment when you realize you have options. And options are powerful. After that private meeting at the hospital, I sat in my car longer than usual. The printed ledger rested on the passenger seat, 12 pages of quiet contradiction. I had several choices in front of me. I could scan the entire document and send it to the family group chat with a short message, for clarity. I could call Claire directly and demand a public correction. I could sit down with my parents and walk them through every line item. Or I could do something else entirely. Each option carried consequences. Public exposure would humiliate Claire. Even if I kept my tone neutral, the implication would be sharp. She misrepresented reality. In our family, humiliation doesn't resolve conflict, it hardens it. Private confrontation would likely lead to defensiveness. Claire thrives in emotional exchanges. She's quick on her feet, fluent in urgency. The conversation would turn into tone rather than truth. Parental clarification felt gentler, but it still centered me as the corrector, the one forcing adjustment. And then there was the fourth option: do nothing, not out of fear, not out of avoidance, but out of strategic patience, because something had already shifted in that billing office. Claire had seen the screen. She had seen my name attached to months of payments. She had heard the coordinator state plainly that the account was nearly 60% covered, and not by her alone. She now possessed the same information I did. The difference was this: I didn't need the family to know immediately. She needed to decide whether she would correct the story herself. That distinction mattered deeply to me. If I forced the correction, it would always carry the aftertaste of sibling rivalry. If she chose to adjust her narrative on her own, it would restore balance without spectacle. So I chose the irreversible option. I chose restraint. But I didn't choose passivity. That evening, I logged into the hospital portal and made one final substantial payment, enough to reduce the remaining balance to a manageable figure before surgery. Not to impress anyone, not to corner Claire, to secure stability for Mum. Then I requested an official, itemized statement emailed to both Claire and me as listed contacts. Not a surprise, not secret, just procedural. Transparency formalized. By doing that, I removed ambiguity permanently. There would be no room left for impression-based storytelling. The system had spoken once in person. Now it would speak in writing. The irreversible part wasn't the payment. It was the structure. From that moment forward, any continued claim that Claire was carrying everything alone would directly contradict documented, shared correspondence. I didn't tell her I'd requested the statement. I didn't warn her. I didn't need to, because truth doesn't require announcement. It requires presence. And now the documentation would arrive in her inbox, just as it had in mine. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. But it changed the trajectory completely. Because once someone realizes their version of events can be disproven without anger, just with records, they face a choice between adjustment and escalation. And escalation, in this case, would expose far more than I ever intended to reveal. I was prepared for either outcome, calmly. The email arrived the next morning at 9:17 a.m. Subject line, itemized account summary, patient balance update. I saw it first because I was already at my desk, reviewing compliance reports for work. The hospital logo sat at the top of the message. Attached were 2 PDFs, one current balance statement, one full payment history. Claire was copied. I didn't open it immediately. I already knew what it would say. Instead, I let it sit in my inbox for a few minutes, breathing evenly, letting the moment settle. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about alignment. By formally requesting shared documentation, I had removed any need for confrontation. I hadn't accused, I hadn't corrected publicly, I had simply ensured the truth would be distributed through an official channel. At 9:32 a.m., my phone buzzed. Claire. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was controlled, not angry, not emotional, controlled. I just got the statement, she said. I did too, I replied. Another pause, longer this time. I didn't realize you'd been paying that much, she said. That sentence mattered. Not because of the amount, but because of the acknowledgement. You didn't ask, I said calmly. Not accusatory. Just factual, she exhaled. I thought you would have said something. There it was again, the expectation of performance. I didn't think it required an announcement, I said. Mom needed the balance reduced, so I reduced it. Silence stretched between us. For the first time in weeks, there was no defensive framing. No heavy sigh signaling burden. No subtle implication that she was alone. Just numbers. She spoke again, quieter. I may have told people I was covering most of it. People can update their understanding, I said. Not you lied, not you owe me an apology, just understanding can change. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about structural correction. That day, something subtle began shifting socially. The family group chat Clerk posted a short message. Just an update. Turns out Faye has been contributing a lot more than I realized. We're in a better position than I thought. No dramatic apology, no emotional confession. But the narrative had moved. Relatives responded differently this time. A few heart emojis, one message from my aunt. So grateful for both of you. Both. That word had been absent for weeks. I didn't respond immediately. Later that evening, I simply wrote, glad we're making progress. No fanfare, no ledger attachments. Moving in silence doesn't mean staying invisible forever. It means choosing when visibility serves stability, not ego. The surgery proceeded as scheduled. The remaining balance was manageable. The hospital staff treated us like any other family navigating a difficult moment. No drama, no spectacle. But internally, the architecture had shifted. Claire now understood something she hadn't before. My silence wasn't an absence. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure, once revealed, is hard to ignore. But the consequences of that realization were only beginning to unfold. Not in billing statements, but in relationships. Because when someone's public identity adjusts, even slightly, it forces a recalibration. And recalibration is rarely comfortable. The shift wasn't loud. There were no arguments, no dramatic family meeting, no tearful apology tour. Instead, the consequences unfolded in quieter ways, in tone, in timing, in the subtle recalibration of attention. After Claire's message in the family group chat, Faye has been contributing a lot more than I realized. Something intangible changed. People began addressing updates to both of us. Before, messages had read, Claire, how are you holding up? Claire, you're so strong. Now they read, how are you both managing? Let us know if either of you needs help. It may seem small, but when you've spent years as the invisible support beam, even a slight redistribution of acknowledgement feels seismic. Claire felt it too. At the hospital on the morning of surgery, she wasn't pacing in front of the check-in desk, showing stress. She sat beside me instead, quiet, focused. We weren't suddenly close. There was no sentimental reconciliation, but the imbalance had corrected. The interesting part wasn't how others responded. It was how Claire did. When people praised her in person, she began adding, Faye's handled a lot of the logistics. It sounded casual, almost offhand. But it was new. Recognition, even in small doses, changes behavior. Still, consequences aren't just about correction. They're about discomfort. A week after surgery, my father asked to speak with me privately. We sat at the kitchen table, where so many assumptions had once floated unchallenged. I didn't realize you'd been managing so much of the financial side, he said carefully. I didn't advertise it, I replied. He nodded. Maybe you should have. That comment could have reopened the wound. Instead, I answered calmly, I didn't think visibility was required for responsibility. He looked at me for a long moment. Not defensive, not dismissive, just reconsidering. That reconsideration was the real consequence. The family narrative had shifted just enough to create cognitive dissonance. They now had to reconcile two images, the quiet, detached daughter, and the one who had quietly carried more than anyone realized. And when people have to update their internal story about you, it unsettles them. Not because they resent you, but because it forces them to confront how easily they accepted the earlier version. Claire called me one evening, weeks later. Her tone was less sharp than usual. I didn't mean to make it sound like you weren't helping, she said. I didn't rush to soothe her. I didn't say it's fine. I said, I know you were overwhelmed. Both things can be true. She exhaled slowly. I guess I got used to being the visible one. That's not a crime, I said. It's just incomplete. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not warm, reflective. The consequences weren't punishment. They were adjusting. Claire had to live with the knowledge that her narrative had outrun the facts. My parents had to sit with the realization that they hadn't asked for verification. Extended relatives had to recalibrate their sympathy. No one was shamed, but everyone was more careful. And that's the quiet power of documentation. It doesn't explode, it settles. And once it settles, people move differently around you. Not because you demanded respect, but because the evidence required it. The surgery healed my mother physically. The ledger corrected something else entirely. But not everyone adjusts easily when their version of events collapses gently. And the hardest part was still ahead. Because realization is one thing, regret is another. Regret rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up in hesitations, in sentences that start and don't finish, in the way someone avoids eye contact for just a second too long. A month after Mum's surgery, when the stitches had healed and the house felt almost normal again, Claire came over unannounced. She stood in my doorway without her usual urgency. No dramatic sigh, no stack of papers in her hand. Just stillness. Can we talk? She asked. We sat at my dining table, the same table where I'd once written, do not react, document. She didn't start with an apology, she started with a realization. I didn't know it had spread that far, she said quietly. What do you mean? I told a few people I was covering most of it. I was stressed. I needed support. And they repeated it. And then... She trailed off. And then it became truth, I finished. She nodded. That's the thing about narratives. Once they leave your mouth, they don't belong to you anymore. They circulate. They grow. They solidify. I thought I could fix it once I realized, she continued. But by then, everyone had already formed their opinions. Too late to fix it easily. Not because I had exposed her, not because I had retaliated, but because documentation had quietly contradicted her in front of the one space that mattered, the hospital ledger. And once people know there's a record, they trust it more than revision. I didn't mean to make you look selfish, she said, finally meeting my eyes. You didn't make me look selfish, I replied calmly. You let people assume it. There's a difference, she swallowed. I guess I thought you'd correct me if it bothered you. I considered that carefully. For a long time, I said. I believed I shouldn't have to. Silence stretched between us. Not sharp, not angry, just heavy with understanding. Claire had always been quick to repair things emotionally. A phone call, a tearful conversation, a public declaration. But this wasn't emotional damage. It was structural. And structural damage takes longer to recalibrate. Our parents had adjusted their perception, yes. The extended family had softened their tone, but there would always be a small residue, a memory of the first version before the correction. That residue can't be erased. It can only be outweighed over time. I don't want us to be like this, she said. We're not, I answered. We're just more accurate now. That was the part she struggled with. Accuracy feels colder than forgiveness. It doesn't come with a dramatic closure. It simply stands there, steady and undeniable. She asked if I wanted her to send another message clarifying things further. I shook my head. If people ask, answer honestly, that's enough. Because chasing retroactive validation would only reopen the wound. Regret can't rewrite history. It can only influence behavior going forward. Claire left that afternoon quieter than she arrived, and I understood something important. The hardest consequence wasn't that she'd been corrected. It was that she now had to live with the knowledge that she had underestimated me, publicly. And once someone sees that they misjudged your capacity, they don't forget it. Not because you remind them, but because the evidence did. Some things can't be reversed. Not the surgery, not the ledger, not the shift in perception. But they can be integrated, slowly, honestly. And that's what we were beginning to do. The real confrontation didn't happen in my dining room. It happened at my parents' house 2 weeks later, over tea that had gone cold. Claire, my father, my mother, and I were sitting together. Not because someone demanded a meeting, not because there was tension in the air, because avoidance had finally become heavier than honesty. My father cleared his throat first. I think we should make sure there aren't any misunderstandings lingering. That word again, misunderstandings. It was gentler than an accusation, safer than blame. Claire didn't look at me immediately. She looked at our mother. I shouldn't have framed it the way I did, she said quietly. I was overwhelmed. But that's not an excuse. There was no dramatic pause, no tears, just a straightforward acknowledgement. My mother turned to me. Why didn't you say something soon? It wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely confused. I answered the way I had learned to answer difficult questions, calmly and precisely, because I didn't want this to become about who was right, I said. I wanted Mum's surgery handled. The rest felt secondary. But it hurt you, she said. Yes, I replied. No elaboration, no raised voice, just truth. That's the thing about confrontation without heat. It leaves no room for defensive escalation. Claire finally looked at me. Did you think I was doing it on purpose? I considered that carefully. I think, I said, you were telling a version that made you feel supported. She nodded slowly. That was fair. And I think, I continued, you didn't check whether it matched reality. No edge, no sarcasm. Just sequence. The room stayed quiet, not tense, reflective. My father leaned back in his chair. We should have asked more questions, he said. That admission mattered more than any apology, because this wasn't just about Claire speaking too quickly. It was about everyone, including me, accepting roles without verification. I had accepted invisibility. Claire had accepted visibility as proof. Our family had accepted the narrative without cross-checking. No one had been malicious, but assumption can wound just as effectively as intention. I don't want us keeping score, my mother said softly. We're not, I replied. The ledger kept score. We're just acknowledging it. A faint smile flickered across Claire's face at that. Not amused, relieved, because the truth had already been established administratively. This conversation wasn't about proving anything. It was about recalibrating identity. I don't want to be the dramatic one all the time, Claire admitted. You're not, I said. You're expressive, but... Expressive, that's different. And you're not detached, she added. You're strategic. That word hung in the air. Strategic. Not cold, not selfish, not withholding. Strategic. For the first time, I felt accurately described. The confrontation ended not with a hug, not with tears, but with mutual clarity. No one promised to change overnight. No one swore eternal understanding. But something fundamental had shifted. The roles had loosened. And when roles loosen, relationships breathe. I walked out of that house without triumph, just steadiness. Because quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about standing still long enough for the truth to reframe the room. And the room had been reframed. There's a version of this story where I become sharper, more guarded, more vocal, more insistent on recognition. But that's not what happened. What changed wasn't my temperament. It was my boundaries. I'm still quiet. I still prefer documentation over debate. I still show love through structure, through early arrivals, contingency plans, and balances reconciled before anyone else notices they're off. But I no longer confuse invisibility with virtue. That distinction reshaped me. After everything settled, after the surgery, after the recalibration, after the quiet confrontation, I made a small but meaningful adjustment in how I operate within my family. When I contribute now, I state it plainly. Not theatrically, not defensively, just clearly. I've scheduled the payment plan. I've transferred my portion. I've handled the paperwork. No explanation, no apology for speaking. Clarity isn't arrogance, it's alignment. Claire and I are different, and we always will be. She processes aloud. I process internally. She seeks reassurance through connection. I seek stability through systems. Neither is wrong, but I understand now that silence without visibility can distort perception, and distortion, left uncorrected, becomes identity. For years, I accepted being the dependable daughter because it felt morally superior, like I was above the need for acknowledgement. But the truth is simpler. Acknowledgement isn't vanity, it's context. Without context, people fill in gaps with assumptions. What I learned through all of this wasn't how to win an argument. It was how to hold my ground without raising my voice. Quiet dominance isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your reaction long enough to let systems, facts, and timing work in your favor. I didn't need to embarrass Claire. I didn't need to circulate receipts. I didn't need to shout, "I told you so." The payment history surprised the room. But what truly surprised me was how little I needed external validation once the truth was visible. That's the freedom. Not applause, not an apology, not vindication. Just accuracy. Today, when someone underestimates me, I don't rush to correct them immediately. I assess. I document. I decide whether correction serves clarity or ego. Sometimes it's worth speaking up early. Sometimes it's worth letting the ledger speak later. The difference is choice. I am no longer the invisible infrastructure. I am the architect who understands how the structure holds. And I don't resent my sister, because this wasn't about her being malicious. It was about both of us operating inside roles we never questioned. Now we question them, calmly, and that has changed everything. If there's one thing this experience clarified for me, it's this. Truth doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it needs a ledger. Sometimes it needs timing. And sometimes it needs your restraint. When my sister told everyone I refused to pay for Mom's surgery, I could have reacted immediately. I could have defended myself publicly. I could have forwarded receipts and demanded correction. But I've learned that loud truth often gets mistaken for ego. Quiet truth, when documented, becomes undeniable. The payment history surprised the room. Not because it was dramatic, not because it exposed a villain, but because it revealed something simple. Reality had never matched the narrative. And once reality is printed in black and white, emotion has to reorganize around it. This story isn't about being the better sister. It's not about winning. It's about understanding that being underestimated can either shrink you or steady you. I chose steady. I chose to let systems speak when people wouldn't listen. I chose to correct the structure instead of chasing perception. I chose clarity over confrontation. And in doing that, I learned something I wish more people understood. You don't have to humiliate someone to protect your integrity. You don't have to shout to be powerful. And you don't have to perform your contributions for them to matter. But you do have to decide when silence serves you, and when it simply allows misunderstanding to grow. That's the balance. If you've ever been quietly carrying more than people realized, if you've ever been assigned a role that didn't fully fit you, if you've ever watched a story about you spread without your participation, I'd really like to know. When have you chosen silence, and did it protect you or cost you?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.